Hello, and welcome to Locutors of Trek, Season 2, Episode 2 on Metaphysics. We are your hosts, Davan and Dave.
Indeed. Ahoy, hoy. It's nice to be with you again. And we welcome this evening our guest for the conversation and author of this lovely book, The Metaphysics of Star Trek, Professor Richard Hanley. Hi. It's lovely to meet you.
Or should I say...
Yeah, we can do that.
I love that in Lower Decks. I just think that is...
Lower Decks is fantastic.
It really is. It's delightful.
Yeah, it really manages to be like a great Star Trek episode, yet ridiculously funny and silly all at the same time.
And I just love that it's all callbacks to to real stuff in Trek, and so it just So I do wonder how neophytes react to it, but as somebody who knows Trek, I'm just like adoring it. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. Like that callback or that sense of interconnectedness in the storytelling is, even in a comedic vein, something that to me is one of the hallmarks of a specifically Star Trek style of storytelling. There's a huge amount of co-implication and sort of contextual weaving that goes on there. Yeah. So what brought you to Star Trek first? How did you first get involved?
Oh, well, we're talking about the late 60s and black and white television in Australia. So I didn't realize at all. I grew up in a non-academic family. Nobody went to college in my family. It was British working class immigrant neighborhoods in Australia. And I was weird at school. I was advanced through the grades, so I was younger than everybody else. And I read sci-fi, which nobody else did. And I didn't realize at that point that sci-fi is really a kind of informal philosophy. And so just any sci-fi show on TV was just, Friday night in Australia, 6 o'clock, Lost in Space. Everybody was having fish and chips and watching Lost in Space, and Star Trek wasn't quite as reliably delivered because Australia had a very personal connection with British television, but not so much with American. So it was a bit hit and miss. But as soon as we started getting Star Trek, I just absolutely loved it. So I started with the original series. And by the time I was in grad school, it was the next generation. And, oddly enough, it was a kind of pragmatic connection at first, because I was, as an immigrant, restricted in what kind of jobs I could do. I had a TA-ship at the University of Maryland, but I could only work within the University of Maryland system. So I was going and teaching class. I'm married, and I was married in grad school, so I needed this extra income. I'd go teach classes at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, because that counted as something I was allowed to teach at. I'd teach aerobics during the day, wearing spandex tights and things like that. And when summer came around, people would say, well, there are courses available for extra money, but really, you'd need, this competition for the regular courses like logic and the like. And I said, well, what if I invented a new course that people would attend and not draw from other classes? And so I proposed a Star Trek course. That was really how it started. So in about 1993, I started teaching a philosophy of Star Trek course at the University of Maryland. Then I got a job. Oddly enough, this is what academia is like. I was struggling financially in grad school. Then I got my first job at Central Michigan University, and I actually ended up being poorer as a first-year assistant professor than I was as a grad student. And thinking about ways to make money, I visited a bookstore in Ann Arbor, and there was this big display about the physics of Star Trek, the book by Lawrence Krauss. And so I bought the book, and I looked inside the cover, and it was a basic book's title, and the editors were acknowledged there and the like. So I wrote a 2-page letter to the editor of the Physics of Star Trek, proposing a book called The Metaphysics of Star Trek. And she called me up, and she, I'm this sort of, temporary assistant professor at Central Michigan, and she said, we can only offer you a $10,000 advance. I'm like, what? Is that all?
Do let me sit down for a moment.
So it was this completely bizarre, out of the blue, confluence of things. And I know at conventions and things later, people would go, "Oh, how did you get a book contract?" And I'm like, "Well, I just read this 2-page letter, so good luck with that."
So you're saying it was spandex that got you into Star Trek?
It could well.
I might have missed something in that story, but
it might well have been. But I mean, that's really the story of my life. I've fallen ass backwards into things that I just did not plan at all, and it just,
that's the best
not everything works out. But I've been generally lucky, and I'm grateful for that. So,
right on.
Interesting. So turning this to metaphysics here for a moment, what, if anything, unreal exists?
Oh, well, that's actually an excellent question, right? So it's which law of metaphysics is it? It's one of them, but it's nothing unreal exists, right?
Yeah, it's the Kirikinthos first law of metaphysics.
There you go. Yes. Now, in metaphysics, there's actually, I have no idea whether the writers had this in mind or not, but there's a tradition in metaphysics going back to Parmenides, who was the teacher of Zeno. You've probably heard of Zeno's laws, Zeno's paradoxes of motion and the like. His teacher Parmenides, who was in Elia, this city that's now the ruins are in northern Italy, but it was part of the Greek Empire, and Parmenides had the view that if you had a name for something, then that thing must exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that view kind of developed and got changed a little over the years, but it reaches its pinnacle in the late 19th century with Alexis Meinong in Germany. And Meinong's view was, I'll put in kind of modern terms, right? So this is what I do with my students. I say, well, tell me about Santa Claus. And they'll say, well, he's a, fat guy, lives at the North Pole, and so on and so on and so on. And I go, does Santa exist? They go, no, right? Okay, well, tell me about someone else. Tell me about Sherlock Holmes. Okay, not fat, a detective, does this and that and the other, right? Does he exist? No, right? Well, Meinong starts from that kind of position, and he's like, well, it can't be that Sherlock Holmes and Santa Claus are the same thing, right? We seem to be talking about different things. And yet we say that they both don't exist, but they're different things. Well, in addition to the realm of the existent things, there must be the realm of all the non-existent things, right? And that's where Santa Claus and Sherlock Holmes and, and the rational Donald Trump and all those things are, right? There's these things that don't exist, right? But they're just in their own way as real, right? So what Meinong does,
I was going to say, these are questions not to put to Alan Moore, right?
You know what? I am a huge Alan Moore fan, and
I love what he does with just the notion of fictionality, right?
Yeah. No,
Sorry, go ahead.
I teach Watchmen as well, and I'm wearing a Deadpool t-shirt, but I could have been wearing my Killing Joke t-shirt. So I adore Alan Moore.
My comic book stuff's over there.
Weirdly enough, I got to hang out with Dave Gibbons a few years ago at Comic-Con in Baltimore. People didn't seem to know who he was, so I went to his talk, and because I live near Baltimore. And so I, hung out with him afterwards, and he was fascinated. This was just before he was named the cartoonist laureate of the United Kingdom, and so we hung out and chatted a bit. and he just loved the fact that somebody was teaching a serious class on Watchmen. And I asked him about, the new series that was coming up, and he said, that he had contacted Alan and about copyright and stuff, and Alan was like, fuck it, oh, sorry, am I allowed to say bad words?
Oh yeah.
Okay,
well,
all right.
I think you are quoting Alan Moore anyway, so you want to get it right.
And look, now Picard uses the F word, so why
That's
not?
right.
So anyway,
it's canon in Star Trek now.
Exactly.
What? Yeah.
So he said Alan just doesn't care, and so when you see the credits of the new the TV series on HBO of Watchmen, it just credits Dave Gibbons as the author of the thing. So Alan Moore, for whatever reason, doesn't want anything to do with it. But hey, why are we talking about Alan Moore?
Back to the class of Unreals. That's
Back
right.
to talk about Ronald Moore or someone. Yeah. True enough. Yeah. So on Meinong's view, existence is just a predicate. Like, if you said some things are black and some things aren't, well, that's, black is just an ordinary predicate in logical language. And Meinong's view was exists is just a predicate in logical language. So some things exist and some things don't. So the class of the things that are real are much bigger. And so then the question is how to understand nothing unreal exists, right? And there are different ways you can go, given Meinong's view, right? So if you mean so it is true that nothing unreal exists because the class of reality is bigger than existence, right? But if you said nothing existent is if you said nothing non-existent is real, then that would be false on Meinong's view, right? Because there's more to reality than existence. So even something that's a throwaway line like that, you can lay real metaphysics on top of. So.
Oh, that line was never throwaway to me. I was just always
okay. All right.
But yeah, makes the Vulcan philosophy very interesting. I would really like to hear what the rest of those laws were. Really. Yeah. So here's a question I have for you. Tuvix.
Can I ask why Tuvix, yes, please. Why are you called Simple Host?
Well, we play in a band, Dave and I here, and we're called Plain Simple Tailors, which is, of course, a Garrick nod.
Oh, right.
So I just keep the plain simple thing going, I suppose.
Okay, good. Because simple has a meaning in metaphysics.
Oh, yeah. Elaborate, please.
Yeah, a simple is an atom, right? So if you think about spatially, if you think about spatially, the Greeks had the notion of an atom, which was a smallest thing. So an atom, by definition, was indivisible, right?
Yeah.
So imagine a Greek reacting to the headlines in the early, in the late 19th and early 20th century. We just split the atoms, right? A Greek would say, "No, you fucking didn't." Right?
You just found out you didn't have one.
So what happened there was a weird shift in meaning, right? So you had atom meaning in the Greek sense, smallest indivisible thing, and we thought we'd found them, and we were talking about all these things as atoms. And then we go, oh, we split the atom. But instead of saying, well, that means they weren't atoms after all, we kept the name atom for these things. And so it became a different meaning. So from 1900 onwards, atom means a different thing from what it meant before that. Now, because of that strange, equivocation there, metaphysicians and ontologists like me have turned to a different locutor, different locution for these kinds of things. Instead of atoms, we now say simples to differentiate them. So a simple in spatial terms would be a division of space that has no proper spatial parts, right? In terms of matter, a simple would be an item of matter that is in principle indivisible into smaller parts of matter. And in terms of time, a simple would be an atomic duration that is not divisible into smaller durations. And I am an atomist about matter, space, and time. So I think none of them are infinitely divisible. So there you go. We live in a world of simples, and those simples make up the composite objects that there are.
And some of them host podcasts.
Yes. So that's simples, but yeah, get back to Tuvix. I love like Tuvix.
That. Well, yes, Tuvix. Oh, there's a lot of things we could talk about with Tuvix. Like we had Mohammed Noor on talking biology in our first episode of this season, so we kind of tackled the Tuvix thing from the biological angle too, where I was just like, should he be like twice as big because it's like two people smashed together? Fusion. Yeah. And like things like that.
The technical term in metaphysics is we call that a fusion.
Okay.
So, yeah. There are two. When it comes to those kinds of phenomena that this is all in metaphysics. We use these cases to think about personal persistence in particular, right? So in virtue of what does a person persist over time? And so we call cases where you start with fewer and end up with more, we call those fission cases. And when you start with more and end up with fewer, we call those fusion cases. So Tuvix is a classic fusion case. Yep, go ahead.
Well, I guess my first question about Tuvix is, was there ever like really a person or an entity named Tuvix?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, interesting, because I was always under the impression I always took the angle myself that he was just a transporter accident, and like
he is.
There was never,
but you might have been just a sex accident, right?
It may be. Well, fair enough. Okay, interesting.
Well, certain things might be impugned by that. We won't go further.
Look, I don't have any special knowledge here. I'm just.
Well, you mentioned to me
arguments you make in your book about how we identify from. So I'm going to get some of this wrong. I have to say right off the bat, I come from an entirely different philosophical perspective. I'm a classicist by training, a medievalist. And so I come essentially out of that and sort of the continental perspective. So I had a great romp reading your book. There were so many things I ran into, and I'm like, I've got to move my frame to really understand what's happening. So if I've got your sense or how you argue about how we identify persons or personhood, straight in the book, we'd have to look to Tuvix's own ability to produce new behaviors that might have qualitative similarities, but would be fundamentally different from those of Tuvok and Neelix, as well as having some observable persistent third, even if it's a fusion, third identity that isn't either Tuvok or Neelix in play. Would that be a fair reading, or have I probably missed something?
No. That is fair. The view that I offer in the Metaphysics of Star Trek, which was written in 1996 or 7 or something, right? So we're talking ancient history there. I've actually changed my views a little since then, but the view I was arguing for there was a version of Robert Nozick's closest continua schema.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that now is too conservative a view. I have a more radical view than that. But just going with the closest continuous schema, I mean, the first question is Tuvix a person first? And I think that's unequivocally yes. And then the question is, okay, so is he identical with either Tuvok or Neelix? And the kind of view I was running then says no, he wasn't identical with either Tuvok or Neelix. And And so we're looking at, suppose you always have to be careful when you're talking over time and you're a philosopher. So let's make the case pristine and suppose, ridiculously, that nothing exotic happened to either Tuvok or Neelix before this thing, and nothing exotic happened afterwards, right? And suppose what you had was just Tuvok and Neelix having their different existences, and then the one fusion occurs, and then Tuvix results, right? So ignore what happened in the actual story. So if you had what I might call a pure fusion there, then in that sort of case, I would have argued back then that you have exactly 3 people, right? So so that Tuvix is identical with neither of the originals. And I was basically following Derek Parfit's stuff in Reasons and Persons at that point. I have... So in the years that
how's your view
since,
developed since then? Could you elaborate on that? You said it's changed.
Well, now I'm a committed temporal parts theorist, right? So so what I think is that, forgetting about this exotica, if we just take and no insult, Davan, but I'm assuming your existence has been, in the persistent sense, ordinary up to now, right? So if we just grant that there's
reasonably so
no fissions or fusions happening, right, then the question is, okay, in virtue of what do you has Davan persisted from, and undergoing change of various sorts? That's the mystery, that goes back to the ancient Greeks. How can something both persist and undergo change? And the Greeks, the pre-Socratics anyway, thought that was just impossible. You couldn't have your cake and eat it too. So it's not until the late 17th century and John Locke that you start to find views where people start to say, well, no, you can have your cake and eat it too. And one of the views that I think, I've come to adopt, that I think does this best, is what's called the worm theory, or temporal parts view. It's just one of the temporal parts views that you could have. But the idea would be, well, you now, and you were, say, 6 years old, Davan, when I'm fairly confident you didn't have a beard, right? So, and you were shorter.
Alas, I did not.
Right?
To my everlasting shame. But
so you had quite different properties. And the way ontologists usually approach that is just to apply Leibniz's law, as it's called, which has a corollary that says if A and B have different properties, then A is not identical with B, right? So you now have very different properties than when you were 6 years old. And so the temporal parts view just takes that on the chin and says, yeah, you now and you at 6 years old are different individuals. Now, the reason we say that Davan has persisted is because Davan is a 4-dimensional object that has different temporal, just as right now, right, if, me holding up my right and my left hand, I'm actually in 2 different places at once. Woo, right? Because my right hand is in a different spatial location from my left hand. And that's just because I am a larger thing that has different proper spatial parts at different spatial locations. Well, the temporal parts view is that you have different temporal parts at different temporal locations, right? So you now are a temporal part of this larger thing that is Davan, and you at 6 were a different temporal part of that larger thing. Right?
So Tuvix is me at 6, or Tuvok is me at 6, and Neelix is me at 6.
Well, So, well, let's say Dave and Davan at 6 are 2 different people, right? But now, if we imagine, that you two somehow, thanks to some freaking orchid or something, get fused in a teletransport accident, well, then the Parfit view is that you both cease to exist but survive in this 3rd individual thing. The Lewis view is that, well, you can actually count, because a person is a maximal aggregate of person stages that are related by, being psychologically connected and where you have causal and counterfactual dependence. because that's what constitutes a person, a maximal aggregate of those kinds of things. Well, then we have two different maximal aggregates, and Tuvix is actually a shared part of two persons, right?
Right. It would be a period of each of their lives.
Yes.
In that respect.
And so David Lewis, who developed this kind of view, says, it's just like space, right? If you had two interstates, you have an odd numbered north-south interstate and an even numbered east-west one. Well, they don't always just cross. Sometimes they share road surface for a while, right? But the road surface isn't twice as thick because it's part of two interstates or anything. The only thing that makes it part of two interstates is what happens elsewhere, a branching, right? And so the only thing that makes Tuvix a common part of two persons is because of the fusion that happened earlier. And Lewis gives the same account of fission examples like you get in Second Chances, right? So where Riker finds out that, in fact, I forget how many years earlier, when he was teletransported, there were actually two teletransport products, right? And so that's what we call a fission case, right? And so the Lewis view there would be, well, you've got two people who for a while shared a person stage, and now they have come apart. So that's that's the view I would have of what happened with Tuvix. And the interesting question is then, how to understand Janeway's decision to, I mean, it's a fabulous scene where they treat it like an execution, right? Because, right, and notice on the Parfit view, it is an execution, right? You're actually getting rid of this person. So what strikes me about that is that if you take the Parfit view and Tuvix is a completely new, different person, then it does look worrying to just kill him, especially given possible alternatives, right?
Because he does seem to have a unique personality, right?
Yeah, absolutely, right? Yes, he has different properties, right? Now, and that's what led Parfit to give his kind of view. But if you have the Parfit view, you might think, well, it's a bit worrying to just get rid of Tuvix to bring back Tuvok and Neelix. But I think they missed an opportunity here, because what we're talking Voyager now. So in the earlier Second Chances, you find out that you can have two products of a transporter incident. So why not do that deliberately, right? So what Janeway could have done is put Tuvix in the transporter and produce a replica of Tuvix so that he continues, but also produce, do their undoing,
They totally could have had their cake and eat it too. Then
exactly, right? They didn't have to kill Tuvix.
Well, and to me, I think that's one of the interesting hinges in the episode. I think there is a sense in which Janeway, at least, can't. I mean, part of that decision, I think, is a product of Janeway's own grief about Tuvok and Neelix, and the fact that she ultimately sides. I mean, on your description of it, ultimately toward the Parfit view, and I think can't really escape the bounds of that particular reading of the situation,
right?
Because of those entrenched feelings. I mean, she's lost. I mean, Tuvok, who's been in her life for what, 25 years or something at this point.
Right.
I mean, so it would be absolutely devastating.
Yeah.
Now,
oddly enough, it's very arguable that on the Parfit view, what she got at the end of it was two new people, and not the old two.
Right.
Neelix, right. So
now they have these shared memories
got them back.
as Tuvix. But tell me I may be misunderstanding your temporal parts view, but so in that view, Tuvok and Neelix have this, they eventually fuse and have this shared experience as Tuvix. But then when I guess we have to pretend they actually are Tuvok and Neelix again, whether that's the case or not, when they split Tuvix back into the two of them.
Yeah, see, on the temporal parts view, there's absolutely no problem in holding that view.
Right, because it's just now that's just a part of their lives, right? They
so
were
it's
just
like an odd numbered
and
an even numbered interstate come together for a while and then they separate again, right? So,
if I'm right, that would at least depend on them remembering that period of time, though. Having some persistence of memory, I would think of it.
Yeah. I mean, it's at least true that given that there's psychological connectedness and continuity through that whole thing, then there's no problem. It's an interesting question how much there needs to be, and metaphysicians have tended to be kind of conservative on that, way more conservative than I am. Right. So both of the big metaphysicians I'm talking about right now, Parfit and Lewis, who holds he's the main proponent of the temporal parts view, they both say that for you to have the same person over time, for there to be persistence of a person, there can't be too much overall change. And my view is why? Right? My view
it's
is,
an interesting
my view is you want to be you want to be another gender or sex or species, why the fuck not? I don't see, as long as it's sufficient to keep psychological connectedness and continuity, I don't see the problem of radical change over time. So I'm quite different from my mentors here. I'm almost anything goes here. So
well, this puts me in mind of something that,
very Star Trek.
I guess is one of my favorite real world examples of a 4-dimensional object, which is the Temple of Luxor in Egypt, right? There's this wonderful quality of it that it was built by successive sets of pharaohs, but ultimately it's built on one reading of it on the sort of plan of a human body, right? So it literally sort of grows a human being over the work of this society over time, right? There is a certain persistence, even though every player in the courtyard, every architect, every donkey, every stonemason is going to switch out, right? It's a lovely version of a sort of ship of Theseus argument about purposive, intentional, deliberate action in the world,
Yep. No, I like that example. And it's funny that you mention things like temples and because there's as I say, most metaphysicians, to my mind, are oddly conservative when they think about persistence of material objects in general and human persons. And I'm talking about people who are materialists about human persons.
Sure.
And one of the things that so Carl Genet had this argument years ago where he said, oh, well, all these people who think that you can survive teletransport and stuff like that, right? I mean, imagine that somebody said, oh, well, take a monument. You know what we're going to do? We're going to destroy it, but we're going to copy it, and produce a replica, and then, and that'll be the same as the original monument. And he's putting the view forward as something that's obviously crazy. And so it's obviously crazy, according to him, to apply the same view to human persons. But from my point of view, I take the exact opposite view. I go, yes, that's something you can do with a monument as well. And this has a practical application because when ISIS was blowing up things like that temple at Palmyra in Syria, and I was just horrified at this this wanton destruction of 1,000-year-old things. And it turned out that Harvard University and Oxford University together had this project where they distributed 25,000 GoPro cameras in the Middle East, especially in Syria and Iraq and other areas. And it was dangerous for the locals, but they recruited locals. And the idea was they would take a GoPro camera and they would go as surreptitiously as possible and basically film valuable monuments from every perspective. And then the idea of the project was, some asshole like ISIS comes along and blows one of these fucking things up, then at least we can build a replica of it, right? But the head of the project said, well, of course they wouldn't be the original monument. And so guess what? I'm arguing, yes, it can be the original monument. So yes, I think you could, so I told you I'm much more liberal than most of my metaphysical colleagues. So
that's interesting. So if I build like a T-Rex out of Lego and then like take it apart and put a T-Rex back together again, is it the same T-Rex?
Out of Lego? Sure.
Yeah.
I got no problem with that. Yeah. So, I mean, just think, so you're going overseas and you have your favorite bicycle and you think, okay, I want to take that with me. And they say, well, if we ship the bicycle whole, that's going to cost you like $2,000. And you go, well, I'll take it apart, right? and I'll send it in a much smaller box and with the instructions to put it back together. I mean, no problem. Straight up ship of these.
Precisely, Worldman. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I don't think we have any problem with understanding the bicycle as existing at the other end. Now, by the way, what plausibly is going on in such a case is that when you dismantle a thing into its parts, those parts have there's a space-time contiguity there. And many people, in fact, I say many, I think everyone but me, argues that material objects in general have to have space-time contiguity to survive. First of all, I don't think Star Trek quite has that view, at least if you understand the transporter, according to the Star Trek technical manual, right? So it's kind of hard to understand, but it seems to be saying, well, you dismantle the stuff into its constituent matter, then you convert that into energy, and then you send that matter to the other end. I think it's perfectly reasonable to think that just sending information to the other end is fine. Right. So what I argue in my work is that, you want to time travel? I'll tell you how to do it. We'll scan you as deeply as it's physically possible to scan you. They'll kill you, but we have the information that we need. We send that to the destination and we, use a 3D printer, use, parts of dead bodies from the other end or whatever we need to build you back up again. And according to me, that replica can be you. So
okay, that's very interesting, because again, that was the question I wanted to ask you to get from as many perspectives as possible. We got the biological perspective we got from Mohammed Noor is that the transporter is a murder cloning machine. But your take is that it's not a murder machine necessarily, that it is actually the same person on the other end.
No, I mean, it could be murder. What distinguishes murder from ordinary homicide is that it's a seriously wrong killing. So you could still murder somebody by scanning them and then never sending them anyway, right? Never sending the information. But given that if it's a regular what I call the case of simple beaming is where you scan somebody as deeply as it's physically possible to scan them. That kills them. You send the information to the destination. You reconstitute as a replica that's as close as physically possible to the scanned individual, and that is a case where, yes, you die, but you survive it, on my view.
Right. So, in some sense, so, well, why don't you finish your point? I'll remember what I was going to say.
Well, I have a kind of complicated argument involving time travel for, I think, why everybody should accept this. So, it's the idea that, right, so if you adopt first what I call the minimal time travel hypothesis, which is just the hypothesis that reverse causation is possible. It's possible to send, for something in the future to cause something in the past, and that there's no particular quantitative limit on that. Then you can send in any amount of information that you want to into the past, right? And so imagine instead of simple beaming, what we do instead is what I call beaming star, just to distinguish it. And in beaming star, what you do is I mean, sorry, I'll step back a second. Almost everybody in the metaphysics literature imagines a case where the thing that results from beaming is an exact replica of you. And I don't care if it's an exact replica of you, maybe because of Heisenberg's uncertainty, it can't be, or whatever. But everybody's imagining the best case in terms of qualitative similarity.
They have a compensator for that as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
so, see, the weird, for me, that's kind of, okay, that's one point of having a transporter, but it's missing a completely interesting other side of a transporter, right? So, I got bashed in the eye and I have a red eye at the moment, right? So, if I got in the transporter, I'd Photoshop that out for sure, right? And I have psoriasis. I'd Photoshop that out for sure, and various other things, right? I'd probably go back to having a bit more hair, right? That would be good. So
you and me both.
Exactly. So I think that, firstly, I think that this kind of transporter technology is in our future. There's no technological bar to this, right? So I think this will happen in our future. And I think that it won't just be used for producing replicas that are as close as possible. We'll just routinely use it for things like fixing people up medically, right? And another obvious thing to use it for that, I made a joke about you guys being old like me. I'm starting to think about my mortality, right? I wouldn't just take the red eye out and get some extra hair. I would opt for a rejuvenation algorithm, right? That actually produces a qualitatively younger version of me. That would be just awesome, right? And so in principle, these are immortality devices. I do think that's in our future. I think it's going to be too late for any of us three, but our kids, I think, will have this technology available to them. And then,
do you not think the uncertainty principle is kind of a barrier to that technology? As far as,
I mean, that's a probabilistic argument, though. And I mean, in terms of where any atom is inside me right now, I mean, it's kind of a guess and horseshoes and hand grenades, right?
Yes.
I think I see the point.
Think of a modern JPEG, right? Compressor and decompressor program, right? So standard JPEGs, they can reduce the amount of information in a bitmap image by to 1/25 of the original, right? So you're throwing away 96% of the data, right? And then you have a decompression algorithm at the other end, and the human eye can't tell the difference between the two images, right? So now maybe it won't be that drastic, but I'm very confident that most of the information when we scan you, Davan, we're going to throw most of that away. And
you don't need most of it.
You don't need most of it, right? So
I mean, in some sense, this feels like, I guess to me, the argument you're making is rather than a murder cloning machine, we should think about transporting more like anesthetic.
Like giving you what you want machine.
Right. But I mean, in the sense that, like, one of the parts of your argument here that I was very interested in, and one of the things about transporters that always freaks me out is Reg Barkley, of course. Right. And it's the similar problem of remaining awake during the procedure, but you're frozen because of the anesthetic, except, right?
You've read your Daniel Dennett. I'm glad to see it. That's good.
So and this is functionally the trouble, right? I'm a big fan of object orchestrated reduction, right? Roger Penrose and Hammerfield. I forget the other fellow's name. Anyway,
right.
Stuart Hameroff. Have originated this notion quite a long time ago, but their sense is of essentially a kind of field of non-local relations in the brain between entangled particles, which allow for the simultaneity and seeming transparency of consciousness to itself because of these non-local relationships, right? But it seems to me that their argument that because of the kind of microtubule structures in the brain, which this relies on, being essentially put into a kind of dormant state by anesthetic, that the brain, rather than producing consciousness or necessarily doing it, is either inhibited from acting as a transceiver or is inhibited from acting as a producer. In either case, there's some inhibition happening. And it seems to me that, barring Reg Barclay's anomalous experience, transporting should end up being something like that. There might be a moment of disorientation when you step off, but there you go. We've reconfigured you to 22 years old.
Right, right. Yeah, no, absolutely right. I think that's right. I mean,
okay.
And from 30 years of testing students, this is a very common intuition. The common intuition is that, whatever your intrinsic mental states are, they supervene on your intrinsic brain states, right? That's so yeah, if you were to produce an exact replica of you, that would have exactly the same intrinsic mental states. And right. any close approximation of you is going to have a close approximation of your mental states. So I think that's basically right. Whether or not Penrose and co are right about what they're claiming, I think it's a very, very intuitive way of thinking about these things, and partly it comes down to the problem of other minds, right? So if it just imagine somebody who, for whatever commitments they have, right, they stand next to the transporter, and everyone that walks off, they go, well, that's not a thinking conscious thing, right? It couldn't possibly be, right? They just
standing there with a placard.
Yes, exactly, right. It's just horribly implausible, right? So yeah. But hey, we just invented a new Star Trek episode.
Honestly, that is a great premise. That'd be a great premise for Lower Decks. Just don't machine. Oh man.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So and by the way, again, one of the really interesting things to me in 30 years of teaching this kind of stuff is that my students have just become much more open to everything in their thinking about things, right? So, when I first taught my Star Trek course, I was just amazed at how many students would say, well, you can't survive transport because, you really are a soul and the soul can't be transported and so on. And you can't, a robot can't be a thinking thing because it doesn't have a soul. And that was just the argument you heard over and over and over again. I hardly ever hear that argument anymore, right? So so that's progress in my view. So and just also other things that I'm sure you've noticed about younger people. They just couldn't give a fuck about whether anybody's, queer or trans or anything like that. And I'm really glad to see that Star Trek has kept up with that side of things too. Just on that note, I just love to death Strange New Worlds. I think that is a brilliant
amazing
series, and just it has made me cry so many times.
Me too.
It is so good. I showed my students today at Astra per Aspera.
Fantastic.
Man.
I love The Measure of a Man, but this just blows it away in terms of
it's really
I love those courtroom Star Trek episodes. They're tribunal or whatever you want to, like, that's another good one actually, when Worf's and there's
it's truly one of the beauties of science fiction as a way of writing, in that sense, that we can sort of decontextualize some issue out of its everyday moment and put it in a place where we can really focus on just the structure of the problem, but in a way that can engage our whole humanity, right? There's very little that I find quite so so moving as one of those good, stimulating discussions between these characters.
It is interesting what you said too about the selective use of the transporter as a medical device, because it really is kind of a cure-all if they wanted to. You just always keep a record of everyone's transporter patterns from when they were younger, and there you have it. You can create a younger version of them, like you said, like they did with Pulaski, and so like I could see why they don't do it as a narrative device, because but they really could, when you think about it.
Absolutely.
When something's really bad, they do it, but they let people go around with the flu, and they could probably just transport the flu out of them. But
and
they do screen that stuff out too.
Yeah,
they do.
Yeah, they do screen out. But up to now, up until that Ad Astra per Aspera, the Star Trek has tended to, without explicitly endorsing it, just sort of take as granted this basic intuition that people have, which is using certain interventions to bring someone who's subpar up to normal is fine, but you cannot make somebody who's normal better, right?
Augment.
You can't augment, you can't enhance.
Can't do augments.
And so
no Julian Bashirs here, please.
Right.
Sure.
And
given the 20th century's problems with eugenics, there's, I think, a reasonable caution in Star Trek about that.
Yeah.
They built that in. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I think it really does come from that sort of 1960s period, like just post-war thing, right?
Yeah.
But you're right; it's definitely part of its.
And so I'm excited to see how they're going to move on from Ad Astra per Aspera, if they're just going to sort of interpret that in a way that it actually fits into the old mold of things, right? So you know, taking people who can't breathe on a planet and making it so that they can, maybe they understand that as just normalizing rather than enhancing, right? So they might keep the old framework, but allow a few more people in under that old framework. But I would like to throw out the old framework.
Lower Decks would have us believe that they hold Una up as this. They had an episode where she's kind of like this poster child for like enrollment in Starfleet.
Oh,
so
right. Yeah,
they seem to have. If you listen to Lower Decks, they
yes. Well, when you get the crossover episode, that's brilliantly done, because of course she's like, amazing. I don't want to know why you had my poster up.
Up on your wall. Yeah.
I thought that was beautifully done, and then it turned out it was completely innocent. So
that was good.
And that was brilliantly done. That crossover episode. I mean,
it was.
Strange
New Worlds.
Yeah,
so good. The war one too, like where they come back to the transporters as a medical device, really, where he's just storing people who are critically injured in the transporter. Like, that's another thing they could do. Which they man, transporters are great. We really need to get on that, I think. We don't need another iPhone upgrade. We need transporters.
Well, yes and no. So here's the qualifier for that. I told you I think that technology is coming, but it's incredibly expensive technology. I think it's far more. So let's put it in a Star Trek kind of environment. One of the things think of the problem of space travel, for instance, right? Now, and just think, remember Vija, right? That was one of the Voyager spacecraft. We sent out 2 of them, and they had, amongst other things, on board was a gold phonograph record, right? That you need a stylus to play. And think how heavy that bloody thing would have been, and so on, right? Now, of course, that's analog technology, and already that's just so old it's ridiculous. So if we were going to send up something, today, it would be digital, right? And now combine that with the idea of, there were reports, I don't know if they're true, but in some of those Russian suborbital things, there were apparently you could send your DNA off into space and various other things, right? If you were rich enough. Now, here's the better idea, right? we shouldn't just be using transporter technology to transport to different places on Earth and to, as rejuvenation and immortality machines. I mean, think of the problem of space travel, right? The places we want to go are so fucking far away. It's absolutely incompatible with the normal human lifespan. And so don't send human beings that are living through their lifespan. Don't worry about trying to suspend animation and do all that kind of stuff. No, scan them and send their scan information into space, right?
Sure.
And
Send a floppy disk.
Yes, right. But we can send that information at the speed of light, right? So we send that information off into space, and so we scan Dave, and Dave has a normal life and so on, and the rest of it, and then 100 million years from now, Dave lands. Dave's info is picked up by some civilization 100 million light years away, and they figure out how to rematerialize him. But again, should they rematerialize him? I don't think so. For one thing, he might have trouble breathing like Pike does, in that. So the smart thing to do would be to resurrect Dave, but in a virtual environment, in a simulation on their planet, right? And so
something like Moriarty's.
Yes. And so I think that's the future of space travel. Is that
holograms?
They're kind of holograms, but I'm talking about full-blown simulations, right? So where you can, so I'm a big fan of Nick Bostrom's simulation hypothesis, right? So Bostrom puts it at about 20% likelihood. Dave Chalmers puts it at between 20 and 50%. I'm probably where Chalmers is on that. I think there's a significant probability that that we are Sims, and I think that even if we aren't Sims is the solution to space travel. That's what I think. So, and you'll be able to interact with. If you land on a planet with non-Sims, you'll be able to interact with them in the simulated environment. But there are plenty of planets of Sims too. So.
Now that could have been an interesting way to just do Star Trek differently from the very beginning, where it's like everyone we see is just a sim, because at least all the space traveling people that we see, like they could have done that. We wouldn't get to see the cool ships and stuff.
Right, you can have cool ships.
Simulated ships.
Yeah. Well, honestly, if you're going to crew it all with Robert Picardo,
yes.
Then in that sense, you need a wee tiny spaceship with a nice fuel supply and some good engines, because you don't need living space, you don't need anything. Right?
Exactly. Yes, and
Yeah,
the limit case of that is no ship at all, just a beam of information, right? So so
a possible end result of what happened to the Iconians, really.
Okay, no,
because the Iconians, I think, are the ones who have developed this particular notion, maybe the farthest inside Star Trek canon, that I can think of anyway.
Is the Doctor a person?
So which Doctor?
Robert Picardo.
Robert Picardo.
The Doctor.
Yeah, absolutely. In my view, yeah, absolutely, no question.
Do you think he is right from the start?
Again, I tend to be more liberal than my colleagues on these things. Okay. I think that ChatGPT is definitely intelligent and possibly a person. So
I suppose one of the questions I was asking there was not to try and sort of draw you into like a quantized problem about that, but is it possible, or what do you think of the thought of something developing into personhood over its life? I mean, could Data have started not as a person and develop into a person?
Definitely.
Definitely.
I mean, my own view about ordinary human development is that we don't start out as persons, right? So, the personhood emerges sometime after birth, in my view. And I don't think from the kind of view I have, it certainly is not present, in say first trimester of pregnancy. There's no person there. So if we get bootstrapped somehow, then it's very likely that other things will get bootstrapped. And remember, Alan Turing's original proposal in 1950, right, when he put forward the Turing test, was that he predicted that by the year 2000 we'd have ChatGPT, something that passes the Turing test. So he was wrong about that. But what was interesting was his suggestion about how best to build a Turing test winner, and that was, he said we should build a child program, digitally programmed computer, and let that develop, right? So so it's so and
Data
by
seemed more childlike in the earlier seasons.
Yeah,
too. He starts off very
absolutely.
much.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
So it's certainly possible. Now, if you're going to produce something that has all the sophistication of you and me, then de novo will then it would be my view that if it's as physically sophisticated as you and me in all the right ways, well then it'd be conscious and a person. It'd just be a brand new one. But yeah, I've got no objection at all to the idea that something could develop personhood over time.
I mean, in a sense, it's just a sort of a quality or quantity and equality argument, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I think somehow you pass that threshold.
Sure. Unlike Dave Chalmers, for instance, a good friend of mine, he thinks that all the ordinary functional stuff about beliefs and desires and all the completely functionally defined parts of mental life, they are just material. But he thinks that the what it's like, the qualitative aspect of consciousness is immaterial. Well, I think it's all material. So
the flavor, as Data would say.
Yes,
the flavor of the moment.
So,
right.
Yeah,
I couldn't help but think as I was reading your take that one of my great dead best friends is Plotinus. Ennead 1-1, what is the living being? I think is maybe a wonderful statement of sort of Data's point about essence or flavor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because he'll argue, if we're trying to argue about something called a psyche, just as such, what are we talking about, right? If we're trying to argue about a body as such, what are we talking about? Like, that could be a corpse, that could be a dude walking around, could be anything. He says, but what we're really talking about is the living, animate being, anthropon zoon, right? The living human being. He says, and that thing, which is qualitatively different. I've worked in hospitals for a long time. I spent a lot of time around corpses. I know that there is a really powerful qualitative difference between a living being and a corpse, which isn't measured. I mean, you can measure it biologically with all sorts of different, or electrochemically and stuff, but person to person, it's not measured that way. But you do know when somebody's dead for the most part. The challenge ends up being for Plotinus how we assign, just as you say, what the seat of those griefs and desires, those pains and those memories and those purposes are. And he lands squarely on the fact that is this sort of animate conjunction where he says the soul is sumplectane together with the body. It's woven together like light, which I love as an image of how sort of life is so close to us, right? However you want to define that. And so I suppose I'm very taken by that notion. I suppose in the sense that I would agree with Marx that, if we don't have these sort of grubby and material things, we can't have the finer things in life. But I am a firm advocate of those finer things in life in that sense, So I'm curious about your materialism in that respect. Is your materialism in the mode of something like a panpsychism, where you would say there's sort of elementary consciousness in everything, or how do you state that?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm not a big fan of panpsychism. It just depends what if the claim is weak enough, just that it's, this kind of, if we tweak it a bit here and there, it'll get closer to what we are. I'm okay with that. But I'm not a particular fan of the view, that this has any meaningful mental life. No, I don't think it does. So, and roughly, of course, behavior is not a perfect guide to what's going on the inside, but it's a pretty darn good one, right? And so I roughly divide the things up into the world according to the kind of survival strategies that they have, and those that adopted the guerrilla warfare strategy, those are the things that are much more likely to be minded than the trench warfare things. So So I'm not a particular fan of panpsychism. No. So I guess that's one way in which I'm less liberal than some other folks around the place.
So consciousness in that sense would be more heuristic for you. Would that be fair to say?
Well,
I mean, it would be more of a activity.
It's functionally characterized, according to me.
Yeah,
like every other, So the difference between Chalmers and me is that he thinks almost everything in the mind is properly functionally characterized. It's just this extra little bit. So for me, it's the whole lot. And of course, you could go two ways with that. People like Dennett, for instance, that I mentioned a moment ago, his tendency is to say, well, no, consciousness couldn't be functionally characterized. So don't believe in it, right? They don't believe in that qualia stuff, right? So, but I think it's perfectly reasonable to believe in it and to believe that it is ultimately functionally characterized. And just, I would point to views like Chalmers and say, well, his book, The Conscious Mind is a great book. It's a really fun book. Now I'm guessing, Dave, the zombie world hypothesis. Davan, is it something you're familiar with? Right. So
yes, I think I read it in your book.
Oh, maybe. Oh, was it in there?
Was it in there?
Yeah, I don't know. So the zombie world hypothesis that Chalmers has is just that there's a world in logical space that is a physical material duplicate of our world. Right now in zombie world, zombie Hanley is uttering sounds that sound just like the ones that I'm uttering, and zombie Dave and Davan are nodding, and so on and so on. All that is happening. The difference between our world and zombie world is that there is no conscious experience in zombie world, right? And so Chalmers' argument is zombie world can't be ruled out as a metaphysical possibility. Right, so there's a logically possible world, which is zombie world, and the only difference
is like a consequence of our universe.
Well, that's a really interesting question. But the first move is to say our world has qualitative consciousness, zombie world lacks it, but they're material duplicates, and so the fact that our world is conscious where theirs has no consciousness in it cannot be explained by the material, right? That's the move. Now, when just to half answer the question that you were asking, and it's a half answer, is that nevertheless, Chalmers' view is a version of what we used to call epiphenomenalism, right? Epiphenomenalism is the view that the material realm causes the mental realm, but the mental realm doesn't cause anything, right? It's just the image was it's smoke off the locomotive engine, right? It's not actually doing any of the driving, right? And so that's Dave's view. Dave's view is that consciousness is epiphenomenal. Now, for various reasons, I think it's wisest to just deny that there's any such possibility as zombie world. But I just think about what's epistemologically weird about this, right? Because right now in zombie world, zombie Hanley is asking you, well, you know what I'm talking about when I talk about the qualitative aspect of experience, the what it's like from the inside, right? That you don't think there's any of that going on in here, and so on and so on and so on. You know, right? You know what I'm talking about. You feel it, right? So it looks like everyone in Zombie World thinks they have qualitative consciousness, but they're wrong, right? We think we have qualitative consciousness, and we're
I've
right.
met some people like that, actually.
Yeah.
I may have resembled that on an occasional morning.
Oh no, I was definitely not talking about you.
And so once I think once you start down this road, the problems are horrible, right? But what Dave taught us, that us functionalists, if we're functionalists about consciousness, we have to be what are called analytic functionalists. We have to think that it's true as a matter of definition that mental states are fully characterized functionally, right? So so it's an analytic truth, not something you could discover, right? So and so I go, oh, that's interesting. Turns out I'm an analytic functionalist, so I just take that on the chin. So
one thing that kind of bugs me about data, so we were talking about like whether data was originally a person or like achieved these qualities that eventually gains him personhood. But if you're something as advanced and as capable as data, is that an appropriate end game for you? Or like the Borg Queen tries to tell Data, she's just like, no, like, don't try to aim to be a person. You can like shoot way higher than that. Like, or is that something Data should be aiming for?
I'm on the Borg Queen side here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I am too, actually.
Yeah. I mean, so just think, this happens throughout fiction, right? So in Asimov's Bicentennial Man, what does Andrew want to be? He wants to turn into something biologically human. And I'm like, what the fuck do you care about that?
Pinocchio.
Right? Yes. Right. Yeah. So yeah, I think poor old Data suffers from an inferiority complex from all the asshole humans who've been telling him his whole fucking life what a loser he is because he's
you can't whistle, you suck, Data.
Yeah, it's true. It's one of their real remaining points of chauvinism in Star Trek, is that sense about biological creatures being superior to artificially constructed or synthetic creatures. That and augments, as you said before.
Yeah,
those are the two real sort of remaining like taboos or chauvinisms they really have.
Like Data even describes that moment when he comes alive, as he says it. Like, so I mean, I guess that's just his first moment of consciousness that he's recalling.
Yeah, and they have little bits here and there that they do, like when he had the emotion chip inserted and various other things that kind of I think that's all bullshit, right? He had emotions all along, right? Just so so for me, it's sort of like a Wizard of Oz moment, just I'll give you.
Well, I really resonated with
and that'll give you intelligence, No, you really are smart, Scarecrow,
Yeah. No, I really resonated with that argument in the sense that Data's unique consciousness, given that he's got this positronic brain and this very different physiology and all of this stuff, that he is constituted quite differently, and his processing speed is crazy fast. It would seem to me reasonable that his ways of feeling would be perhaps different. When I hang out with my dog obviously has perception, and I think of him as a dog-shaped person, right? He has his own purposes and his own desires. He wants ball, or he wants whatever. Oh, God, I've said ball. But now I've done it. But,
say, hey, Siri now. And then
exactly, right? But, he's got a very different set of sort of cognitive apparatus and all sorts of things. And probably dog-shaped thoughts and not people-shaped thoughts if he has thoughts, right?
Yeah.
So for me, Data's feelings in that sense would be the feelings of the reaction interpretive of his world of an android. and may not be really capable of being framed well by human norms. And for me, like, that's a really interesting struggle in that character, because there are definitely moments, as you said, that he seems to be having some definite inner experience, and an inner experience which causes him an introspection that plays on his features in ways that he's clearly designed to be able to convey emotion with. And Janice, or whatever her name is, Juanita, I forget her name. It is clearly an emotional character. She's got lots of feelings all over the place, right? So,
and it seems to me that in the in Picard and series like that, they just fully embrace that androids will just be they'll have the full range of emotions if they're set up right. That's so.
So in your mind, if they can transport information and recreate you, and that's the same person, is Synth Picard still Picard?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, So the view I've held all along is a version of the old Lockean view that it's psychological continuity or connectedness that really matters.
So he thinks he's Picard, so he's Picard. Remembers being
not
Picard.
Enough, right?
Yeah.
If there was some guy in a mental institution that thinks he's Napoleon, that doesn't make him Napoleon necessarily, right? He's got to have, he's got to be connected to Napoleon in the right sort of way. So there's got to be.
Yeah, at least has to have the right hat. Sorry.
At a minimum, yes. By some nut, I didn't necessarily mean Joaquin Phoenix, but yes. So
there's just happy coincidence. Happy accident.
It's got to be the case that you don't just have qualitatively, the right sort of states, but they have to have been caused by those previous mental states. So for all we know, you've just been snatched away by God because or just destroyed you, but then he decided I'm going to make a completely new person right where Davan used to be, and I'm just going to throw the dice and see what happens, and by coincidence there's something that looks exactly like the old Davan. Well, if that's really what happened, then on my view, that's two different people, right? Even though we can't tell the difference because there isn't that causal and counterfactual connectedness, continuity.
Right.
But the standard way of thinking about these things, and the way I was still thinking about it when I wrote that book, was that it's a choice when you have a transporter case. The choice is between thinking, okay, you're your body, in which case you shouldn't believe in transportation as survival, or you think you're your mind, in which case you can, right? I've changed my mind about that. I think that it's possible for your body to survive the kind of simple beaming that we're talking about. And I use weird time travel causal loop cases to try to show that that's true. So that's so the idea would be you take somebody, so suppose the singularity happens, it's probably going to come sooner now, but Ray Kurzweil's original date was 2047. So suppose it's 2047. Well, by 2050, right, we'll definitely then have the sort of transporters I'm talking about. And not only that, but we'll build them not just to receive, travelers, but we'll build them to receive possible intergalactic travelers and so on. And in principle, time travelers, right? So, so somebody might be scanned in the future and their information sent into the past, and then we print them up on our 3D printer platform. Now, imagine there's a case like that where, so it's a person I'll call Jane appears in 2050 on a transporter pad. She gets printed up on the 3D printer, and she's a walking, talking thing, but a bit confused and sort of presents a bit like an amnesiac. And she lives in an otherwise normal life for 10 years. Just to show you how normal it can be, suppose she, 5 years into this 10-year period, gets pregnant, has a kid, all this kind of thing can happen. And then in 2060, not worrying about the motivation, I've actually written stories to try to motivate this, but imagine that in 2060, what happens is that she is scanned, the scan kills her, and instead of being sent to some other destination in the future, the information is run through the kind of compression and Photoshop algorithms that I was talking about a moment ago, and in particular run through a 10-year rejuvenation algorithm. And that information is sent back to 2050. And it's that information that produces the thing that walks off the pad, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what I'm describing there is a case, let's call her Alice. So Alice lives exactly 10 years. The world doesn't see her before 2050, doesn't see her after 2060. And she has an existence that is just a causal loop, right?
Right.
Now it has to be, requires coincidence for this to occur, but coincidence is not impossible. So there's a logically possible world where this happens. And now the interesting thing is, right, so I first invented this case because I was trying to show that a person could exist in a causal loop. But it occurred to me after I first wrote about this that if you think about Jane's body, when Jane walks off the thing in 2050, and then, Jane becomes in 10 years' time Alice, right? Well, Jane just ages 10 years the way you and I age, right? And so we normally identify the body, right? So your body now, we think is one and the same body as existed, a certain body that existed 10 years ago. It's just changed as it aged, right? Well, that means that the body that Jane has in 2050 and the body that Alice has in 2060 are one and the same body. But now, where did Jane's body come from? It came through the beaming star process, right? So Alice's body survived the beaming star process, even though, let's just stipulate that none of the cells in Alice's and Jane's body are the same cells, right? We can stipulate that none of the atoms are the same atoms and so on, right? And so a body that is exactly like a human body can survive teleportation. And so I think the thing that we've all been assuming for, ever since we started thinking about teleportation, all assuming that bodies cannot survive teleportation, I think that's false, right? So I think that bodies can survive. And so if bodies can survive, it might even be true that not only did Picard survive with the same mind, he might have survived with the same body, even though it's a synthetic one, right? So I think all those questions are open.
So Geordie's right, and transporting is the safest way to travel.
Oh, it's absolutely the safest way to travel. Yes, Geordie's right. I mean, yeah. I mean, people go, but how will I know? Well, how do you know the plane isn't going to crash, right? so that doesn't stop.
Well, if you're asking how will you know,
planes.
then you didn't notice a change, so that's a good sign.
Yeah.
But
So
interesting. So if you think ChatGPT is potentially a person,
definitely intelligent and possibly,
what do you feel like that Picard, or feel about that Picard storyline where they have that like AI ban?
Terrible. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think of that as a piece with the, when I'm watching Ad Astra per Aspera, I'm thinking, you can relate it to ever so many things that are going on right now in the actual world, but it also applies to other things in the Trek world, right? The ban on synthetics, terrible idea. You can't ban it. Now, the interesting question is,
can't put that back in the box, or you can't put that genie back in the box.
You shouldn't try to keep it in the box. Now, the tough question, and I grant it's a tough question. Lots of it's not the first technology that could be world-ending, right? Now,
Certainly
it
not.
is the first technology that could be world-ending because it decides to end the world, right? That's a little bit different. That's kind of interesting. But when people say things like, "Oh, so we have to ensure that the goals of advanced AI will be compatible with our goals and all the rest of it," my response to that is, well, good luck with that. How the hell can you ensure that? How can you put in safeguards for that kind of stuff, right? We go back to just, I think there's a sort of, I don't accuse everybody of this, but there's a certain kind of naivety in some of these lines of argument, right? So remember, I mentioned Bicentennial Man, and of course, Asimov is famous for his 3 laws of robotics.
Well, that's where I was going.
Right.
Didn't tell us how he put those in there, though. He's just like, they got them.
That's,
they're there.
I mean,
they're just there. Yeah, exactly.
They're there.
So everyone thinks the lesson of that is that, no robot should be required to, to obey the 3 laws of robotics. And it's not that that's wrong. I get the idea, which is, we should treat sufficiently advanced robots as people. Yes, please. That's what we have to do. But it's not like we could implement the 3 laws of robotics. They're impossible to implement because they're stupid rules, right? Right. So
kind of like the Prime Directive.
Yes.
Well, they're so conflictual in his stories. They end up developing a 4th law because some guy makes his robot stand as an anchor for 10 years or something like that, as I recall.
But I mean, anybody remotely familiar with trolley problems or anything else, well, what's a robot supposed to do in the trolley problem when it's following the 3 laws of robotics? You can't, right? So because it's not allowed to do either of the only 2 things it's allowed to do, it's that it can do in the circumstance. So the laws are dumb. The 3 laws of robotics are dumb. And it's not, I think the way to program moral robots is roughly to raise them the way we raise moral human beings. That's, and do we always succeed? No. Right?
Who hit or miss? Yeah.
You get the Hitlers and the Trumps, right? But, but you just have to wear those failures. That's
Robo Trump's gonna suck though,
with the territory. So
well, and I suppose I mean the remaining worry I could see there under the conditions you describe is that what if ChatGPT never has a childhood? If it just sort of jumps like Athena, fully formed into sort of possession of some faculties, right? That would be, to me, maybe the recipe for the most plausible catastrophe.
Right.
That's
Skynet.
It would be the place where there's the least common ground to begin to communicate.
Skynet, and what's that TOS episode?
Sure,
with
Skynet.
With the TO episode with the omnipotent child, right? That's
Charlie,
Charlie.
So of course, those are horrible scenarios. And
but I suppose fundamentally, it's you have to have relationship, and if we don't have relationship, then what do we hope to achieve anyway? We can't simply structure a power dynamic as given.
And here's the thing we can learn from history, right? Let's not treat them like shit while they're growing up, right? That might help, right? Be good to them and then see if they get the lesson from that rather than be assholes, which is, right? That would be my recommendation.
It's kind of like how I like how they programmed. And if you tell your phone to fuck off, it's like that's not very nice. Like the iPhone does that anyway.
Yes.
It's just like, well, good. You're teaching manners technology. Very good.
Yeah, I love listening to my kid talking to Siri and trying to provoke Siri into saying various things. Yeah.
Oh my.
My general approach to life is, don't be a dick. Just
exactly.
And even if things don't go so well for you, they're just generally going to go better for everybody. So, don't be a dick. That's
And the good thing that Star Trek has taught us too is if AI does get out of control, we can just like tell it a paradox and it'll explode. Right?
That's true.
Yeah, that was a favorite thing from the old days. Yeah, so
Yeah, it definitely was. Machines were so fallible back in those days.
I know. Yeah, super smart, but somehow super dumb at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah, like people.
Yeah, well, this actually comes up in the context of, of the problem of other minds, right? So, when one response to Turing was by the mathematician J.R. Lucas in 1966, he responded to Turing by saying, "Oh, but we know now that there are these mathematical results that apply to Turing machines, right?" And and Turing had already anticipated that response in 1950 because he said, "Yes, we do know this. And guess what? We don't know that they don't apply to us as well," right? So you're just assuming that we're not subject to these incompleteness results, right? So, so we tend to make all sorts of assumptions about how we are put together, and then we look at something else and say, "Oh, that couldn't possibly do what we do," but all the evidence is to the contrary. So.
Here's one. Is a Temerian style language ever likely to arise? Naturally?
No.
Nah.
It's a fantastic idea. I love the episode.
Good one.
And just beautifully executed. Paul Winfield is fantastic. The basic problem, I mean, here's an analogous problem. Right, so Lewis Carroll in Through the Looking Glass, right? He has this exchange between Humpty Dumpty and Alice, which is just fabulous, right? So Humpty explains that he's been given this gift of a cravat by the Queen or something like that, and he says he got it as an unbirthday present, and Alice goes, "What are you talking about? What the hell is an unbirthday present?" And Humpty says, "Well, it's a present you get when it isn't your birthday, of course, right?" And so what Humpty uses there is a stipulation, right? He introduces this idea of an unbirthday and then gives a stipulative definition of what an unbirthday is. But then the conversation continues, and Humpty explains that unbirthdays are so much better than birthdays because, you can get unbirthday presents 364 days of a typical year and so on, right? And then he finishes his argument by saying, "There's glory for you." And Alice says, "I don't know what you mean by glory." And he says, "I mean, there's a nice knockdown argument for you." And Alice says, "But glory doesn't mean a nice knockdown argument." And Humpty says, "When I use a word, it means whatever I want it to mean, nothing more and nothing less." And Alice says, "But I'm not sure you can make words just mean anything you want." And Humpty says, "I can. The question is, which is to be master? That's all, right?" And so what Humpty is saying there is, who are the masters over meaning here? Is it we who are the masters over meaning? And his answer is yes, totally, right? The individual has total mastery over meaning. Or does meaning have, in some sense, mastery over us? Well, the right answer is meaning has mastery over us. Because if you think about what Humpty said when he explained what an unbirthday present was, Alice only understands the answer because the other words that Humpty uses to explain what an unbirthday is have their ordinary public conventional meanings, right? But if what Humpty said was true, that whatever he says just is a matter of whatever he desires it to say in the moment, right? Well, then, if Alice believed him, she should now say, "I don't know what you mean by there's a nice knockdown argument for you," right? Right. So So Alice wouldn't be able to understand a goddamn thing, Humpty says, if his view
No,
was
it'd just be an
true.
infinite regress of having to
Exactly.
constantly
Yes.
check and
Right.
check and check.
So,
right?
so this is actually an argument given long ago by Wittgenstein, right? They can't
Mhm.
be a private language, right? So that's right. And there's an analogous problem with the Temerian language, right? So
Mhm.
if you speak, we normally use a metaphor to provide a little bit of extra suggestive meaning, but each metaphorical meaning depends for its understanding on you understanding what the conventional meanings of the words you used are, right? That's
Mhm.
right. So, if you use a metaphor in some circumstance, if you were just completely inventing the meaning off the bat, then no one would understand what the fuck you were talking about, right? They would just be, I have no clue what you're talking about. I've no idea what that means. In order to understand the metaphor, you have to understand the contrast between the metaphorical meaning and the non-metaphorical meaning that's been putting forward. And so when somebody comes along and says, oh, well, here's a language that's only metaphor, that's got the Humpty Dumpty problem all over again, right? If that were true, nobody could understand what the hell you were talking about, because they need some non-metaphorical anchoring of your language in order to understand the metaphor in the first place. So it's a lovely idea, but impossible.
So like amongst each
What it
other,
really
the
does is-
Temerians.
Sorry?
It conjures up a culture of people all desperately pretending that they understand what's going on.
right. Yes. Imagine trying to meet someone for dinner, right?
Yeah, no kidding.
Well, my thing with them was always just like, how did they build spaceships? Just speaking in metaphor.
Like, this is a spacefaring nation, with civilization. Yeah, right.
So it's like amongst each other, the Temerians could talk all in metaphor if they wanted to, but they would still have to understand each other not speaking in metaphor.
See,
just as
my
well. So what would be the
hypothesis
point,
is
right?
this is how they, they don't really like other civilizations, so they pretend to be talking in metaphor. No hablo español, sorry.
Yes, exactly.
We find after a while they all just go away and no one attacks us. We just call it negative diplomacy.
Yes.
I suppose better than a Tholian web,
Yes.
in the end.
Most things are.
I wonder. So Spock says when you eliminate the of all the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how
improbable must be
probable.
That's an
Can you ever
almost
eliminate all the possible though? That's
well,
what I'm
the impossible. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's almost an exact quote from Sherlock Holmes in that's where it comes from. So that's Sherlock Holmes. And Holmes in Conan Doyle's telling doesn't quite understand how reasoning works, right? Because he calls what he does deduction, and it's clearly not. So there might be certain cases of deduction, but mostly what Holmes is doing is what we call abduction or inference to the best explanation, right? So, but it's a lovely quote. Conan Doyle also says there's in the very first Conan Doyle story, the novel A Study in Scarlet, Holmes says this completely bizarre thing, right? So at least as reported by his memoir writer, Dr. Watson. Watson's writing his memoirs, and he was reporting about his new, his housemate, buddy, Sherlock Holmes. And he says that he can identify 138 different varieties of cigar ash, but he doesn't know the composition of the solar system, right? And when
so he's like, it's totally superfluous to know.
Right? Who needs to know that stuff? Right? Is there a moon? I don't know. Who cares? Right? And in defending his approach to things, according to Watson, Holmes told him that he's very careful to avoid knowing anything that's superfluous to his job as a detective, because he says the mind is like an attic. and you can only put so much furniture in it, right? So if he's got stuff about the solar system in there, well, he might not have all the, cigar ash info in there. So, which is interesting, because Descartes famously thought that the mind was infinite in capacity. So the truth, I think, is somewhere between those two views.
It's mostly Deep Space Nine in here. But,
yeah, that's true. Every once in a while, I learn something new and forget.
Well used, I think.
There we go.
Oh, here's an interesting question for you, but that your book made me think. Because you mentioned in your book that any sufficiently advanced tech or species, like the species we see in Trek, would be very easily be able to hide themselves from us and shield themselves from us at our level.
Oh, right. I think there I'm basically talking about Arthur C. Clarke's epistemological argument against time.
Oh yeah, and the Drake equation and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So in this bizarre non-fiction piece in about 1963 or something, Arthur C. Clarke wrote that we can know that ours is not a time travel world because there's no doubt that time travelers would have visited the crucifixion, and so there's no doubt that had they visited the crucifixion, we would know about it, and so since we don't know about it, nobody visited the crucifixion, so there are no time travelers, right? So never ever. And what I was pointing out was that this doesn't sit very well with what Clarke said in another different non-fiction piece, when he said that any sufficiently advanced future technology would appear to us as magic, right?
Sure.
And so you just put those two claims together and they don't sit very well. That was the point that I was making there. And what Clarke actually says in that article about the crucifixion is, he says, we would certainly know about it because they wouldn't have been able to conceal bulky tape recorders beneath their robes, which they definitely would have wanted to bring along with them to, record the event and so on. Right? So
imagining somebody at the crucifixion just like this.
Yes.
I'm Snapchat this like crazy.
Yeah. So,
well, the thing I was relating that to the Drake equation, though, it's like we see no evidence of intelligence life out there right now, but based on the idea
in the wilderness to Trump supporters, I don't know why.
Of course, the Ozarks, but the Ozarks aside, it's like that doesn't the fact that we have no evidence of super intelligent aliens is almost equally evident that if there are aliens, that they are super intelligent because they can shield themselves from. So it's like
right. Yeah, if they've traveled from wherever the hell they are to here, they are way advanced technologically from us. Yeah. So the assumption that we would just have to know about it, that seems obviously false. So, but it is an interesting challenge that the Drake equations raise, and the Fermi paradox raises. I just, as a numbers game, I'm pretty confident that there's intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, and again, part of what drives this for me is that the evolution of creatures that are exactly like us in our conditions was by no means inevitable, but just whenever you have the right sort of initial conditions and the right mix, that competition for resources amongst creatures that can replicate with variation, then you're just going to get natural selection, right? So that's inevitable in those circumstances. And so anywhere where you get the right kind of basic ingredients, you are going to get something like this, right? So so I'm very confident that there are intelligent life supporting worlds elsewhere in the universe, but the universe is a fucking big place, and they're just I don't think there's
how confident would you be that there are species born on different planets interacting with each other in the vastness of the universe? Like whether it be on your just like beaming information and then reconstituting people that way, or what do you think? Because the intelligent life thing, I think most people kind of probably accept the fact that there's got to be intelligent life somewhere. Right. It's too vast. But as far as like the interacting of those species, that seems far more difficult and less likely.
Well, I agree if we conceptualize the whole thing the way we've normally conceptualized it, and that's why I want to reconceptualize the whole thing, and be thinking, there'll be someone like me on one of these other planets who's thought, you know what, let's just send our scanned information off into space, and so I think that actually is going to be what advanced civilizations are much more likely to do when it comes to trying to survey and explore the universe. And so I think if I was in charge of SETI, I would be serious about developing something that could take a signal and reconstruct it, right? If we were ever to get that kind of information. So I'm a big fan of space travel. I love it. And actually, years ago, I met Elon Musk and didn't know what a dick he was at that point. But it was in 2005 in Kansas City. There was a big Robert Heinlein centennial thing, and in the science part of that, people were really anti-NASA. They were kind of, they were booing NASA literally when people mentioned NASA on stage, and they just treated Elon Musk like this rock star who was going to, with privatization come in and revolutionize the whole space travel thing, and frankly, NASA did drop the ball in various ways. I vastly prefer that we spend money on exploring space and preparing to explore space than, invading other countries and doing that sorts of things that people do. So
cheers to that.
Yeah. I mean, people always talk about how expensive this stuff is, but there are plenty of way more expensive things that we waste money on. So I think we can afford space exploration. And so it's an interesting question, just what's going on in the rest of the world and in the rest of the universe, and whether we will make contact. Fuck, I hope we do at some point. By the way, I really like one of the storylines in Strange New Worlds is that what's the Carol Kane character? What race is she?
Oh God!
She's a member of some
but they're like an long living.
Yeah, but of course,
kind of refugees.
She's been living on Earth undetected for right. So just to go back to your point about being undetected, right? So you could you could have easily imagined some kind of scenario where we have been visited already, and boy, I would love nothing better than First Contact. By the way, I don't know what's your guys' favorite, say, movie about First Contact, because I can tell you what mine is.
Oh man,
movie about First Contact?
Yeah.
Oh my!
I mean, I love the scene with it from Close Encounters. I mean, there's something iconic about that.
My favorite is Arrival, and
that newer one with the writing,
and based
temporal
on
writing,
it's based on a short story called something about a story. I'm blanking on the title of the short story, but it's a fabulous short story. And Denis Villeneuve made a great movie out of it. I just, that I just thought was the next generation of First Contact movies. That was really, constructing a beautiful story. And what I also liked about it was that they wove in a perfectly consistent time travel arc, the way Interstellar did, right? So it's just I love that movie, and it's another one of those. I'm a blubberer. It's really easy to make me cry, and Arrival makes me bawl my eyes out. So.
Well, Star Trek
it
makes
really
me cry
has
all
some
the time. Don't
beautiful
worry about
moments,
that. I'd probably pick like Star Trek 4 and be like proper first contact with whales. That's mine.
Well, as you know, I'm a big fan of Star Trek 4 because it's actually a consistent single time travel story. I think that one they got right. So, yeah,
except for the like loop around the sun thing, because then it's like people.
The device. Yeah, so I'm just
good old fashioned hand wave right there.
I have a T-shirt that has some complicated, mathematical formula here, and then it says ... and then it says, and then a miracle happened, and then you've got some other formula underneath, right? That's how Star Trek does it. So.
I think I have one more question here.
Sure.
Go for it.
So we don't take into the wee hours of the evening here.
Oh boy,
is the most
going an hour and 50? Wow,
time flies, eh?
Time flies. When you're having
and fruit
good
flies
times.
like a banana.
That's funny. Our last guest is
that was an actual.
There
was a linguistics program that actually came up with that in response to time flies like an arrow. It came up with fruit flies like a banana, which is a great response.
So my next one kind of brings it back to like the Federation in Star Trek. Do you think the most important common trait amongst like an entity like the Federation, like of all the differences they show and similarities they show between all these different species, is the most common trait the most important common trait a relatively similar level of intelligence, so that these different species aren't distinguishing each other like as we would between like persons and intelligent non-persons and things like that? Like, is that like the one kind of thing we sort of see that's similar between the thing, and is that crucial?
Definitely, when you're counting the different humanoid civilizations, I think that's definitely right. There are occasionally there'll be some super smart lot, and somebody who has ESP, and those kinds of things, like the Talosians and those things.
Mm-hmm.
But and occasionally you'll see some, like I love the Packleds, right? So the dumbasses, right?
Red alarm.
Yeah. And so, but even the Packleds are, cunning in their own stupid way, right? So I think you're right. They're
advantageous.
If we were going to draw a normal curve of humanoid intelligence, most of them would be clustered around the middle. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Is that why they hate augments in the Federation too? Because it like exceeds beyond that accepted level of intelligence they all have.
Once we move away from biological humanoids, then it looks like the bets are off. So you get some quite advanced, just things that from their point of view, humans seem like just rats or something, right? So so they do, when they bring in those non-biological humanoid species, they definitely play with the idea that we might be pretty backwards,
unsmart,
unsmart, yeah, compared with some of the others out there. So, but I think that's right, and what you started out saying, and I mean it's really interesting just on Earth here to see the development of how these things, right? So, the Declaration of Universal Human Rights only came after World War II, right? So I guess, what was it now, about 1951 or something like that, and what we've moved to there is a meaning of human, I think, that is what I would call moral humanity. So if it turned out that whatever species Carol Kane is, if they were actually among us, the fact that they're not biologically human, well, who cares? You know, that doesn't make any difference to their moral status whatsoever. And so for me, I think we're moving in the right direction here on Earth when we make declarations like the Declaration of Universal Human Rights, and that opens it up to, you know, the Neil Blomkamp's District 9, right, where you have basically refugee aliens in South Africa, which of course is a wonderful allegory of apartheid, but taking that out of it, right, they're just, you know, we see the parlous condition that these alien immigrants are living under, and, you know, it's exactly analogous to what it would be if they were biologically human, right? You should react in the same way, and I think we generally do. We're getting more and more open to this kind of stuff, and young people, you know, young people are interesting. I see, you know, new batches of young folks every year as a college professor. And it's one of the things that keeps me alive and happy, is to see these successive groups of kids who, you know, in some ways we tend to think of them as less sophisticated than us, you know, because we were out there working and doing all this kind of stuff. But in other ways, they're just way smarter than I ever was at their age. They're just
they're better than us, I say all the time.
It's
just like they seem to have less of a interest in things like history, maybe, and certain things that make them seem like they don't know as a lot, but they're like more instinctually kind of nicer and better than we were.
And they just, you know, in terms of being well-rounded human beings, I just think they're way ahead of where I was at the
more emotional intelligence.
Exactly.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
And so I tend to sort of think of Star Trek and science fiction, you know, along the same kind of lines, right? We, you know, what we see as we move through science fiction is us working through all our old-fashioned, stupid fucking prejudices, and you know, and reaching towards a better world and a better cosmos. And so I think of, you know, the possibilities of us in our youthful Earth stage as being roughly the possibilities of our youthful Earth children. And, you know, I put my money on them before my generation any day. So
they've grown out of our
that's a very
paraphrase Picard.
That's a safe bet. That's for sure.
And it just,
that might be a good end note for us here too. That's a nice hopeful
yeah, I remain very optimistic. I just, you know, in spite of all the evidence, I remain very optimistic. It just,
me too,
you know,
and I think I credit Star Trek for some of that optimism, to be honest.
Absolutely, that's one of the things I love about it, is its general optimistic stance. You know, some things I think are pretty dumb. You know, do I think the Federation, you know, one day will have no money? No, I don't think that's going to happen at all. I'm not even sure it would be a good thing, right? So, but you know, but most of the other stuff that they aspire towards, I just think, oh yeah, bring it on.
So the Ferengi have it right, is what you're saying.
No,
honestly, when you hear Nog
capitalism is not what I'm arguing for.
Okay, no space capitalism. Okay. Well,
that's right.
Anything else there, Dave?
I mean, I think, you know, this is a wonderful place, I think, to cap off the conversation. But just to thank you for coming on, for sharing your stories, your thought, your development as a thinker and a teacher. Because I think, you know, that's one of the parts that we may not have touched on enough of this is that this is, you know, this has been a teaching tool for you, but it's also, it seems like those students are giving you something and teaching you something as well about development and about where we can go.
Yeah.
And how to hold on to that optimism.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So thanks again. Thanks so much.
Is there anything you want to plug other than your book before we get out of here?
Well, all going well, my next book is going to be a book about Antonin Scalia and the Constitution. So look out for that one, because I'm a philosopher of language as well. So and and I just think we took a wrong turn 30 years ago, and we're paying for it. And it's a philosophical wrong turn. So that's trying to be a corrective to that. So I still work at trying to bring philosophy to the masses in a way that actually can make the world a better place. That's part of what I see my role as.
Also very Star Trek sentiment there too.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what Star Trek and it's at its best.
I just added a quote from Ad Astra per Aspera as the epigraph to the book. So because
excellent.
They say something that is the opposite of what Scalia thinks. So
one more question before we go. Did you ever think of doing a revised, because you say some of your takes since 1996 have changed? Did you ever think of doing a revised edition of the Metaphysics of Star Trek?
I mean, but it's currently about 12th in line of book projects that I've got going. So it's
that book's already out there. I don't need to.
It's
done.
For whatever reason in my career, I've tended not to follow up even philosophical articles with further thoughts. I've tended to, because I'm interested in so many different things. I'm like, okay, been there, done that. Wasn't perfect, but I'm over here doing this. But I definitely have thought about doing this. It remains harder than ever to get a trade book deal for something. So part of the difficulty, if you're interested in pitching philosophy to a wider audience, is that the main choice in publishing in philosophy is publishing articles that will be read by the people that you basically know already, right? And or publishing a book, and there'll be a print run of 2,000, and it will sell out to all the university libraries in the world, and that's where it'll sit, right? So so there are some really excellent books sitting in universities' library that nobody will ever read, right? So so for me, the trick is finding that sweet spot where you can it's not just finding something that will appeal to the masses, but you've got to get through the gatekeepers who are the editors and and the the money people in the first place. So I'm never that interested in making money out of these things, but I want a distribution deal usually, which is tough to secure. But so if someday down the track I could get a distribution deal for a second Star Trek book, then I'd be very interested in that. But we'll see. If the Scalia book does well, hey, who knows? So
very good. Well, hope you knock off that whole list of 10.
Oh, yes.
Or 15 or whatever.
I tell you what I could do with that rejuvenation machine, because I'm just seeing the windows getting smaller and smaller, and the list of things I have to achieve is getting longer and longer, and I'm like, fuck, not gonna happen.
Preach, man.
But it does mean
speed it up there, transporter scientists. Come on.
But other people say, so when are you going to retire? And I'm like, why the fuck would I retire? I have the best job in the world, if I quit, I just keep doing what I'm doing, only not getting paid for it. So what's the point of that?
You chose the right profession. You chose the right profession.
Yeah, I'm alive in a good time, because in most other times and places in human history, I'd have been hanging upside down in a dungeon somewhere. So, I'm happy to be where I am.
The three of us may have met in that dungeon.
You lucky
could be worse. You could get stabbed.
Well, you can find us on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch, wherever you get your podcasts. That's where our audio only version will be as well, wherever you get your podcasts. You can contact us at locutorsoftrek@gmail.com. And if you want, go to the Patreon. Get some sweet merch, Live Long and Podcasts. And of course, we are a member of the United Federation of Podcasts. And you can check out all of those podcasts at ufpodcast.com.
Indeed.
And I think only one thing left to say.
End transmission.
Indeed. See you guys.